Hello and welcome to Nothing Is Real, a podcast about the Beatles. Everybody thinks they know the Beatles, but how much do we really know? My name is Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And we're live on tape from Dublin. Today we are going to talk about the Beatles Anthology, and we envisage a couple of podcasts scattered throughout 2020 looking at this 1995 project, because amazingly it's 25 years since the Beatles Anthology came out, and at the time it was heralded as 25 years since the Beatles had split. So we're kind of at a recurrent point in time to have a little look at the Beatles Anthology. So today we're going to look at the road to the Beatles Anthology going into production and how that happened and what made it happen. Broadly speaking, I'm a big fan of the Beatles Anthology. I think it's a great document and I'm glad it happened. Are you the same, Stephen?
Yes. I mean, both at the time and now. It's a document that's a documentary that I go back to and dip into. Yeah. I don't think I've watched it all the way through sort of episode 1 through to the end, but it is a great to dip into.
And certainly episodes. At the time, it was, again, purely accidental, it was a great moment of timing to get it out in 1995.
Yes.
But as we're about to discuss today, there was a long and winding road, ho-ho.
I see what you did there.
To get it to the general public. So let's have a little look at this part 1 of our anthology podcasts and look at the road to anthology. And it's interesting because it actually predates 25 years. It seems to go back to about 1968 when Apple has been set up. We're in the post-Brian period, and Dennis O'Dell is involved in trying to set something up. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so he's been brought in as the head of Apple Films. So at this point, Apple as a concept, you've got Apple Electronics, Apple Music, Apple Tailoring, Apple Publishing, Apple this, Apple that. I think there was going to be an Apple School at one point. So the film side is headed up by Dennis O'Dell, and he is given the task of basically creating an archive, collecting together newsreel footage, interviews, just the history of the band.
And it's kind of quite foresightful when you think about it, because they'd done the Hunter Davies biography, which they may or may not have been happy with, and this was another way of trying to get a grip on their history and their legacy, while they're still very much an active band.
Yeah, so the Hunter Davies book is, Lennon in particular was always very critical that it was a bit of a whitewash. It was a sort of sanitized version, and it's tempting to speculate that this was the band saying, well, we've got the book, we've got that official version, that sanitized version, we can tell this story ourselves through the medium of television and do a documentary. Yeah,
and so they start to amass, as you say, footage from around the world, and realising the value in some of this stuff that perhaps people didn't have. And they had I think their film archive was in Boston Place in London. So there's a bit in Anthology 2 where Paul sings "When I Was a Robber in Boston Place," and he's obviously singing that song to the Apple archive.
He's so talented, Paul.
He has so many things on his mind.
So musical, it just comes spilling out.
But we start to get an official word. They this isn't something that they're doing in secret. That it starts to get discussed publicly, that this is something that the Beatles are doing, and it kind of starts to fall under the remit of Neil Aspinall. So even though Apple is undergoing a lot of flux, and Alan Klein is coming in 69, in 1970 Neil Aspinall is still talking about this documentary.
Yes, I mean, Aspinall is one of the people that sort of survives the Klein clear out.
Yes.
And he is the kind of trusted insider. But yes, this is an official project. It is being talked about. It is well known that this is being done and that they're amassing this. And at one point, I think there's some confusion about the Let It Be film and this film archive project, what they're gathering footage for, but it's definitely it's on the official Apple project list.
Yeah, and I think Neil says something in about 1970 to say, we'll just get the Let It Be movie out of the way first, and then we're going to try and get the movie out after that. And it's also reported in the Beatles Book Monthly is still being published in 1970, and in October 1970, they're still talking about there might be a Christmas release date for this movie. But I suppose the main thing that happens in the end of 1970 is that there's Paul's legal court case.
He just ruins everything.
And even though the Beatles are in a state of flux, for them to kind of go into a state of legal flux, the project kind of gets shelved at the end of 1970 and doesn't really come to pass.
No. So yeah, I think that the kind of the legal, one of the fallout pieces of fallout from that split is this movie just is shelved.
Yeah. But then once the first round of legal issues are over, or I suppose once Alan Klein starts to move away, it does sort of bubble up again. And it's mentioned a couple of times in the 70s that this, and I suppose it's worth saying, Neil Aspinall, I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably know who Neil Aspinall is, but he's, confidant of all four Beatles. He drove the van back in the early days. He ran Apple until the 21st century. He, stayed true to the Beatles and fought for the Beatles all the way through. And when we think about the Beatles Anthology, his name is on it, his fingerprints are on it. It is the thing he really wanted that he fought for all these years.
Absolutely. And I think the key thing about Aspinall is that he remained on good terms with everyone.
Yeah.
So he was at the centre of, so whenever John and Paul weren't speaking, or Paul and George weren't speaking, Aspinall seems to be the sort of the central figure around which all of this was sort of happening and all of this was revolving. So he is the sort of the one that they all seem to trust. And
whether it's kind of a personal interaction or a business interaction, he is protective, and he is very concerned with legacy.
Yes.
And not diluting the Beatles, and not, he was the person who for years seemed to put a stop to multi-disc box sets, or the Beatles going to mid-price and all this kind of stuff. He constantly put a premium on the Beatles.
They seem to have given him a degree of autonomy as well. He seems to, and we'll see this when we come on to talk about the actual anthology project. He had a say. His input and his advice was valued.
Yes, and he had trust, which is a very hard commodity to get from one Beatle, let alone four Beatles.
Exactly. So what we have is that sort of period of 1970, 1971 into 72, where relations, particularly between Paul and John, are at a low ebb. Then they start. They have a meeting at which they decide, look, let's stop sniping at each other in the press, and let's just dial it down a bit, and we've got to kind of get past this. So that sort of takes us into 1972, and at the end of 1972 this project starts to be talked about again as surfacing, and up to this point it's been called The Long and Winding Road. By the end of 72 it's been called 10 Years in the Life of the Beatles, or something like that. So they're moving away from The Long and Winding Road.
And there was an interesting 10 years of the Beatles campaign at that time. EMI were, with all the solo Beatles, were kind of running a 10 years of the Beatles. So it would have made sense that might have been an idea that would get wrapped into that.
It is that 73, 74, particularly in America, with the 10th anniversary of the Ed Sullivan Show, Capitol, where there was an upswing in, I suppose that's really the first upswing after the split, is the Red and Blue albums coming out, the 10-year campaign from Capitol. So it seems to be in that, against that background.
And even though John is over in New York at the time, it's on his radar as well. So he talks about it he's on the Today Show in 1974, at the end of 74, and he talks about that there's a film coming in with, I think he refers to it as The Long and Winding Road, doesn't he?
Yes.
So it's this thing that's bubbled around in the background, but there's all this legal issue about what the Beatles are, what Apple is, what exists, what doesn't exist. And so in 1975, legally the Beatles don't exist anymore. They signed the paperwork, and Apple as a filmmaking entity doesn't exist anymore. It exists as a business
company,
and as a company, but Apple Studios closed. I think maybe that Son of Dracula might have been the last Apple film.
The last great.
Have you ever seen that?
No, I've seen bits of it. It's available in little sections on YouTube.
Yeah,
I'm not sure
I couldn't watch the whole thing. It's as much as it includes people I love, like Harry Nilsson and Ringo Starr, telling the story of Dracula. It is a hard watch.
Better than Broad Street.
Well, I've watched Broad Street,
yes.
So I'd take Broad Street any day, because the music is so good, So in 75, Apple Studio closes, they stop making films, but Neil keeps working on this documentary, and he starts incorporating things like home video footage and footage from India, and it seems that, at the end of 76 or so, he has a working version that he sends to the Beatles.
Yes, and there's clearly work has been done on this. It's not just sticking clips together.
No.
There is, it is coming together.
Yeah.
As with a sort of a narrative flow to it.
Yes. And so, this is an idea that refuses to go away. And, towards the end of the 70s, there's, Apple is having board meetings to discuss what's going to happen next. Apparently, directors are scouted. This is
McCartney is saying. I've heard him say, that they contacted various directors. The Ridley Scott, the Spielbergs, the Scorseses, just as you would, to see if they would be interested in coming in to do this. And it is interesting when you sort of think that was back at the end of the 70s.
Yes.
But then that's the sort of approach that was taken by Scorsese in the Dylan, No Direction Home, or the Harrison Living in the Material World, where you get a director in to sort of marshal
what you've got
on existing clips. It's not a director in the sense of traditional sort of movie making. And it's interesting that that's what they were thinking of at that time. This is what we need, is an actual director of the stature of Spielberg or Scorsese or Ridley Scott to come in and
sort it out.
Work at this. Now, it's not clear to me why that didn't progress. So you've got this period where Aspinall in 75, 76 is got his working draft, if you like. Within the next couple of years, McCartney is saying, well, we did look around, we were trying to get someone to do this, but I don't know why it didn't.
Because even right before his death, doesn't Lennon in a deposition talk about the fact that we're going to do Beatles activity and this kind of stuff, which seems to be alluding to this documentary and the fact that it's going to involve the Beatles getting back together in some form again.
And I think you've got to be very sceptical
about why he said
that. That was in the context of trying to shut down other people exploiting the Beatles name. Said, well, you can't do that because we are going to go out and exploit our name again.
But it wasn't totally untrue. It was in the ether.
It was in the background. There was something there, but I don't have any information and haven't been able to find any information about that kind of 3-4 year period up to Lennon's death as to why it didn't happen.
And so if you kind of look at the 70s, something we've talked about before is that the Beatles kind of had to learn how to anthologize themselves, or how to retrospectively work on their legacy, whether they wanted to or not, or what that legacy meant. And in the 70s, people did start to look upon this kind of rock and roll revolution about something that was worthy of critical discussion, and this was a thing that happened and what it meant. And you kind of look back at, well, what was doing the job of a Long and Winding Road type documentary in the 70s? And there's a couple of things that kind of come to mind. One is the All You Need Is Love Tony Palmer, which kind of puts a very serious slant on rock and pop and soul music.
Yes, that's a show I remember watching as it aired. I think it was kind of late. It's a kind of weird thing that television was in at that period. That went out, I think, from memory, in the UK, late night Saturday, 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
And you think that's a weird time to be sitting down to for the target audience, you imagine, would all be out clubbing or going, selling each other drugs on street corners. But I remember, and I bought that was re-released a few years ago on DVD, and I bought that, and that's a fantastic watch. It's a completely different pace. It's a very leisurely unfolding of the story.
Yeah.
And I have to say, it's clearly, we maybe touch about the Rutles documentary, but it is clearly the Rutles documentary is a parody of that style of presenting in a raincoat with a microphone chasing after a lorry up the street. But it's clearly this very slow, leisurely, academic approach.
Yeah, and we'll come back to our friends the Rutles in a minute, but we might actually just talk about the Long and Winding Road itself, because last year when we had friend of the show Mark Lewison in, I sort of asked whether the Long and Winding Road was out there, and I was told, yes, it is, of course. Call yourself a Beatles fan, haven't you seen it? And then very kindly a listener to the show sent me somehow a copy of it. I don't know how that happened, but thank you, John. That was great.
Yes, thank you, John. He sent me a copy as well.
And so I sat down, and for the first time I watched a late 70s work print of of The Long and Winding Road, which seems to have been dubbed onto a VHS cassette. And it is interesting.
Yes.
It is definitely, as you say, a work print of something that it's not just edited together. There's a bit of thought to it, but at the same time there's no narrative.
No.
And it's all chronological structure of telling of the stories. And there's no interviews.
There's no interviews. It's just but they have the Shea Stadium clip where they're kind of superimposing the band across the audience.
Yes.
And, there were little bits in there that I hadn't seen before.
Yes.
Little interview clips from later on in the career, but it is all there in the sense that it's just moving the story forward.
Yes. And so I've kind of just written in a quick lineage of what happens in the movie. So it kind of opens with the Liverpool montage from the Yellow Submarine cartoon, and then goes straight into the Some Other Guy cavern footage that we've seen loads of times. There's a little bit of an interview with Brian Epstein talking about seeing them in the cavern, and that's the first of the bits you see that carry through into the anthology. There are little bits in The Long and Winding Road and you're like, that is just copied and pasted into the anthology in 1995. And then there's footage from Love Me Do, George talking about Mac Shaw, and that footage of how long are we going to last? We don't know. We don't know what's going on, and all the rest. And then there's footage from the first US visit to that film to show their touring around the US. And then for Ed Sullivan they show I Want to Hold Your Hand, not All My Loving, which I thought was really weird.
That was strange, because you sort of think if you were pitching this at the American audience, All My Loving is the song that has the most resonance. And then it kind of skips from then the chronology goes off a bit. It kind of skips into Yesterday, the Blackpool Big Night Out footage of Yesterday. So it kind of skips from 64 to 65 and then skips back. It shows loads of footage of them doing their Shakespeare skits, which is odd. Yeah, that was I watched that thinking, why have we got so much of this? Is this you imagine that's something they hated doing? Or certainly wouldn't want to dwell on.
And then it goes back to like A Hard Day's Night movie. There's a bit of Jimmy Nicol in there. But chronology goes over the place, then it jumps forward to the Help movie, and it shows one bit that I found really interesting is when they're telling the MBE story. Did you notice this? That there's some footage of a marching band outside Buckingham Palace,
and what they're playing
is the Liberty Bell footage, which is the theme tune to Monty Python's Flying Circus. So you're watching this documentary and up comes that famous Monty Python theme tune. I wonder whose idea that was. But the Monty Python music is playing in the middle of this while they're discussing hanging out with Her Madge and getting their awards. The Help movie doesn't play the Help song, which is odd. The first George Harrison song they play on it is I Need You, so nobody's sitting at home with a stopwatch saying who's getting exposure,
who's getting the most time,
and then the words Christ appear on the screen, and they jump straight into the KKK footage. Again, a very familiar piece of footage from the anthology where that guy is being interviewed. Well, there's some surprises in
so
in the universe of The Long and Winding Road, they don't cover Rubber Soul, they don't cover Revolver at all.
No.
They just totally skip. They do the movies, they skip those late 65, 66 albums.
That made no sense because you have particularly, you've got Paperback Writer, you've got Rain, you've got promo films for those two periods. So that seemed an odd omission. But
there is stuff where they're showing split screen footage, and it's obviously been edited together and planned and put in a way, in a thoughtful way.
Well, if you think about what was happening when this started in 69, 70, it was the Woodstock movie, which really pioneered that split screen idea of you had this building the stage while Crosby, Stills and Nash are playing, and that was obviously very cutting edge, I suppose, in the early 70s.
Scorsese was involved in the editing of the Woodstock film. So
well, there you go.
And then there's a brief clip of How I Won the War, and that kind of leads into the second part. It goes into the Strawberry Fields Forever video.
That completely took me by surprise.
That's a nice
because you're suddenly watching it, and then suddenly there's pictures of Germans and bombing and Nazis, and I thought I'd be back at the kind of Liverpool start of anthology thing. That took me by. It took me a minute before suddenly Roy Kinnear appears.
Figure out what's going on. So they show us the Strawberry Fields Forever video, not the Penny Lane video, but they do have footage from the A Day in the Life video, and then All You Need Is Love is kind of split screen with Maharishi, and that kind of introduces the Maharishi. They show Hello Goodbye, but with some of the footage from Flying.
Yes.
which is odd. And then they show loads of Magical Mystery Tour clips, which is fair enough. And then they show a big chunk of Blue Jay Way, obviously a toe tapper
Yes.
for the kids at home. And then there's some more footage that people know quite well. If you follow the Beatles, the Apple Boutique news footage of people milling around, and the footage from the music documentary where they're doing Hey Jude in the studio. But that's actually a good edit. They take that music footage and they mix it with the David Frost footage, and they give a good kind of montage.
Yes,
of Hey Jude.
that was well done. And that's why I say it does betray the fact that you know, there is a creative element to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they have the David Frost Revolution clip. They have some clips from the Apple documentary, Dick James being interrogated by John and Paul, that kind of famous clip where they're giving him a hard time.
That really is uncomfortable.
It really is, but it's totally, knowing what happens next, it's even worse. So if you haven't seen this clip, it's taken from a 20-minute film that was made in '68 about the Apple organization. And Paul and John are in a meeting with Dick James, their publisher, who they believe is not after their best intentions, and you know, they're kind of anxious about getting control of their songs, not losing control of their songs. And Dick James is saying, I'm not going to do anything.
I'll never let you down.
I'll never let you down. Everything's fine. And as we know, the following year, he sells Northern Songs to Lou Grade, and that is a scar that haunts Macca to this day. Then there's some great footage from Let It Be, which I don't remember seeing again. Or seeing before, which is do you notice the footage of John making plans to meet Alan Klein for the first time?
Yeah.
I don't recall seeing that ever before.
I don't think I'd ever seen that.
So it's really it's some of the standard footage you know from Let It Be, but you actually see John making the plans to make that first fateful meeting with Alan Klein the following Monday night, and he's like, I'm gonna go in and meet him, and the music that plays straight after Alan Klein is summoned is I've Got a Feeling. Yeah. So there's some very subtle editing and fun going on. And then there's footage of Yoko and Paul and Linda getting married, and Ringo's rowing a boat promoting the Magic Christian. And what's interesting is at the end of the movie, John brings in, there's three of us writing now, George is losing out. That kind of narrative that we kind of came up again last year.
Yes,
when Abbey
I was
Road
going to say that really is sort of emerging last year in the context of Abbey Road. That you know, when it's time to do something, we know that it's time to do something, and now there's three of us writing, and you know, we all fight. But he kind of rather disingenuously is saying, you know, we take it in turns. So we do my track, and then we do Paul's track, and then we do George's track, which is nothing of the sort.
Yeah.
So
and then it ends with the Something video, and they play The End over placeholder credits lifted from Magical Mystery Tour. So it's interesting. It's definitely a work in progress. It's not a finalised thing, but it certainly couldn't have gone out in that form.
No.
And there was two things that it kind of reminded me of. One was in 1978-79, The Who put out The Kids Are All Right.
Yes.
Which is an interesting kind of comparison, because The Kids Are All Right is you know, it's a retrospective film of clips of The Who in performance from about 1964 up to stuff that was specially filmed in 77-78. And when it was in production, Keith Moon was alive and he saw the final cut, and by the time it came out he had sadly died, so it kind of became a different thing by the time it hit the cinemas. But it certainly grabs that notion of you know, we're going to tell the story through performance. Yeah. And The Kids Are All Right had a guy called Jeff Stein directing it, and he was a super fan who said, no, I can do this. And, you know, perhaps had a different view to someone like Neil Aspinall, who's trying to put things in a linear order. You know, maybe that was the notion of calling in a Scorsese or a Spielberg, was to get the editing right, get the dynamism right. Yeah. What is the, you know, do you have to tell a true story, or are you trying to tell a different, entertaining story?
I think that's the thing. It isn't clear. Yeah. You know, the work in progress cut that you and I have seen, it's neither just a selection of clips, nor is it a finished narrative, or is it's something in between, as if it can't quite decide. And maybe it just is literally just a guide to say, well, look, this is what you could do, or this is what you might want. The Kids Are All Right. I watched that again this week, and that's a fantastic piece of work.
It is a great piece of work.
And it's interesting that it sort of takes you can see the evolution of the band without the narrative, without interviews, but
even without it being strictly chronological,
and without it being chronological, but you can just see the development of the band. I mean, it's quite, I would say, it's kind of quite depressing towards the end, and the sort of, especially, Keith Moon is clearly in bad shape.
Yeah.
And but it tells a story, and it tells the story of the band without, as you say, interviews, or without necessarily being a linear.
And when it was being made, the band were around. They were alive and active, and they had started their own film division. So they were trying to get product into the cinemas that would make them money. And they apparently found the Kids Are All Right, the Who found it a very funny film. They thought it was hilarious.
Right.
When they first saw the working cut, they were just apparently in stitches on the floor, just laughing at themselves.
Well, this is the idea also. What's the motivation for doing this? Is the motivation for doing this to make some cash?
Yeah. Is
the motivation to simply get ownership and pull together those clips and those archives, so that Apple own it, that the Beatles own it, or that the Who in there own it? Or is it to present a particular version of the story, the official version, this is the way it is, and push the narrative? I didn't get a sense watching The Kids Are All Right that they were particularly pushing a narrative or trying to get a story out there, or a version of the band. Some of it is quite, I say that, if I had been in the band, I might not have been too happy about some of that latter footage being included, but they clearly are quite happy. But maybe, say, all three of those things come into play. But as you say, with Aspinall, it's clearly this curating the legacy was his driving force.
And so the other thing I noticed watching The Long and Winding Road is the influence on the Rutles. So famously, George Harrison gave a copy of a working print, maybe this working print of the Rutles, or of The Long and Winding Road, to Eric Idle in preparation for the Rutles. And there's one or two bits that, if you weren't knee deep in Beatles lore, in the Rutles, they mightn't have made immediate sense. The big one being John and Paul being interviewed in the white suits for Apple, which is lifted straight into the Rutles.
Yes.
And, when you see it in The Long and Winding Road, Eric Idle must have seen that whenever it was 77, 78 and gone, oh, I'm having that.
I'm having that.
It's
and also the clip of them talking about Epstein's death.
Yes.
Where the Rutles are kind of, were shocked and stunned.
Yes.
And if you look at the footage of Lennon and Harris, they are completely stunned. They are completely in shock. Yeah. And yet they're having to step outside and have microphones, shoved in their noses, saying, right, well, how do you feel? Your manager's just died, and what were you going to do? And when did you last speak to him? And what did Maharishi say to you? And it's an incredibly intrusive thing.
Yes.
But yet Idle is able to take that and make that hilarious.
Yeah.
A really sort of kind of tragic, poignant moment, but yet he can find the humour in that and
make it work.
Yeah.
And so Lennon's death kind of slows things down a little bit.
Yeah.
But then in 1982, another thing appears which perhaps tries to do the job for Apple, and that's a documentary called The Complete Beatles. Compleat Beatles. Just thought I'd get that out there. Which I remember in the early 80s, mid 80s was kind of a video stalwart. It was always on VHS cassette.
Yeah. And
it's an interesting documentary. It's difficult to get a viewing of. It is. I watched it on YouTube. It's all broken up into to little bits, and it's not sort of in chronological order. You have to kind of watch it in 10-minute. Yeah, I found a very blurry Spanish subtitle version on Vimeo.
But the one I had was sort of Japanese.
It is, and I do remember it being around. It is a sort of about 100-minute documentary. And amazingly, they have the rights for the songs and for certain types of clips in it. That's
what was surprising to me. I suppose you're used these days.
You're used to everything being locked down.
Yes, everything is locked down. But 1982. Clearly these things were available. And
there are talking heads being interviewed in this, not the group Talking Heads, but various people from the time, none of the Beatles.
But that was actually the most interesting aspect of this for me, was normally you sort of think, well, the most interesting period is going to be post 66. That's the sort of really interesting aspect. But it's the talking heads from Jerry Marsden, Tony Sheridan. Tony Sheridan looks fantastic.
He looks like some kind of wizard.
He looks like he reminded me of Richard Harris.
Yes.
So it looked as if it was maybe from the late 70s that this interview had been done. But Alan Williams, Jerry Marsden, Tony Sheridan, Bill Harry, all of those characters from the early days of the career.
And it talks a good bit about Hamburg, and it has Horst Fascher,
Yes.
the German promoter, is interviewed as well, and he's
Yes.
talking quite openly about prostitutes that they were hanging out with and all that work they were done in. So it's certainly not sanitized, and they give a lot of weight to that pre-fame Hamburg era, and they really draw it out very, very well.
They really do. That's the aspect of it that I really like. The other thing that we should say is they have Malcolm McDowell is the narrator. And first I had forgotten that, and when I started to listen to it, I thought, that's Derek Taylor.
Oh, right, right.
The voice really, I don't know whether he was deliberately...
but it is very serious. I mean, it's very much like The World at War.
Oh,
it's a bit what it's like. It's like, this is important.
The opening line is, poets of a generation, heroes of an era.
Yes.
It's very portentous.
Yeah.
And this is important, you've got to listen to.
But it is written in a very economical, fact-filled way, and it does follow the story chronologically, and there's a couple of things you could kind of pull out of it that perhaps doesn't get right.
Yeah.
But it gets a lot of things right than wrong.
Yes, and I think it's a very good template. And if people can put up with watching it in 10-minute segments, I would recommend that you seek it out.
There's a couple of inconsistencies. So I said there's some great people interviewed for it. The thing must have been a rights nightmare, because they have footage of Ed Sullivan introducing the Beatles, but again, they don't show any of the Beatles' Ed Sullivan performance. They play the recording of All My Loving over a screaming audience, and they kind of get around it that way. But they do have footage, say, from the Washington concert that they played at the start of '64, and there's some inconsistencies where they show a copy of Rubber Soul with the UK track listing, but Revolver with the US track listing. It doesn't talk about US albums.
It's interesting if we think about the fact that as far back as 1968, Dennis O'Dell is trying to buy up and gather in how much stuff in 1980, 81, 82, when this was being put together, how much stuff was still available and out there for use, for exploitation. But
then again, when they come to talking about Magical Mystery Tour in the Complete Beatles, there's only stills, there's no clips, because obviously that is Apple owned and Apple controlled, so they're not able to get to that. But there was one or two interesting bits from the interviews. They've Lenny Kaye, who's the journalist, musician, chronologiker, compiler of nuggets, and he's very much in the praising of Sgt. Pepper mode. We're still in that. We talked about in the Sgt. Pepper episode, where it's, this is the greatest album of all time, the greatest album that will ever be, and that is what he's trying to get across. And probably there was two really poignant bits in it. One is Marianne Faithfull talks about the weekend that Brian Epstein died. Yeah. And she frames it in the way of, they were away in Bangor learning to be individuals with the Maharishi, and just at the moment where they learned to be individuals, Brian died. And I was like, oh my God.
She's poetic.
She is poetic, and she's taking it very seriously, and it's a very striking interview. And the other bit I really liked was Billy Preston is interviewed.
Yes.
And he turns around on the piano and just says, I played the solo, and it goes like this. Yeah. And he plays the Get Back solo on a piano, and it's just absolutely fantastic. But it's an interesting piece because it does tell the story. It does have great clips. It does have the rights to the actual music. It was directed by a chap called Patrick Montgomery, and the film was produced by Delilah Films and Electronic Arts, and MGM UA picked it up for home video rights, and actually did get a cinema release in 1984 as well. But it does have this very serious, portentous, historical, and you're thinking, man, the Beatles have only split up 12 years ago.
Yes, but that's the other thing. It's only 12 years ago,
and they're taking it so seriously. But it just go to this point about talking about legacy, that this is what they were trying to do, what they were trying to get across. Apparently, and we've debated, you and me, whether this is true or not, we don't see the movie these days because it's owned by somebody.
Yes. Supposedly Paul McCartney bought the rights.
Yes, and he bought the rights in the early 90s in order to get it out of the way for the main anthology event. Yeah. And that's something that's said on IMDb and Wikipedia. It must be true then.
Yes, I'd like somebody to be able to confirm that, because it's also talked about it did get a Laserdisc release. Well, you think if it had a Laserdisc release, there would be better quality footage on YouTube.
That is true, yes.
Perhaps John, our source, can confirm whether this is true.
So something that I think is interesting as the 80s progress is that people start to eulogise and chronicle the 60s because they are further away, and they chronicle the Beatles and John Lennon, because John has died. And there are two things that happen at the end of the 80s. We get the Imagine John Lennon documentary, which we don't need to go into, but it's a cinema release documentary that is a big hit on home video. It's a 90-minute John Lennon documentary directed by Andrew Salt and, done under the supervision of Yoko Ono, and it has a successful soundtrack which has Beatles songs and John Lennon solo songs on it, and is we start to get an idea of how these things can be done.
Yes.
And then the second documentary that's perhaps less celebrated but is still kind of important is the 1989 Paul McCartney Put It There documentary.
That's over to you.
Well, no, this is just a documentary / puff piece to go with the Flowers in the Dirt album.
Yeah.
So before Paul had set off on touring, it's an hour-long plus TV special of clips and performances and a bit of history. Promoting Flowers in the Dirt, but it's interesting because it's put together by people who had come on board to make the Beatles Anthology, so mainly Chips Chipperfield and Jeff Wanfer, who are the producer and director who work on Put It There, who get the job of producing and directing the Beatles Anthology.
And the other thing about that Flowers in the Dirt tour is there was an opening film, which I think I'm right in saying was directed by Dick Lester.
Oh, right.
And that was footage from right across McCartney's career. So you have Beatles clips, and because again, I remember at the time I saw one of the London shows on that tour. That was the first time I'd seen McCartney, and you watched all of this footage and all of these Beatles performances, and then he took to the stage and opened, I think, with maybe Figure of Eight.
Right. Yes.
And you thought it was slightly anticlimactic after, but again, he was kind of locked into that, tapping back into that Beatles legacy, and that was really the period where he is starting to, the percentage of Beatles material in his live shows is increasing.
Yeah, he's touring for the first time in 10 years, and it's a Beatles heavy show, and he's ending with the Abbey Road medley, which he still does today. Yeah. And that kind of leads to the last bit of the path towards anthology. So there's probably about 3 events that happen in the late 80s, early 90s that kind of lock this thing down. And we'll talk about them individually. There's the legal settlements with the Beatles. There's George's financial situation. And then there's just general passage of time and life.
Yes.
So the first issue is, the Beatles in 1989 finally sort out their legal issues.
Yes.
Don't they? These are things that have gone on for a long, long time.
The override. Well, we've talked before about, Paul had this override where in the late 70s he negotiated a little extra royalty for Beatle Records compared to what the other 3 got. And it wasn't taken from their royalty, it was taken from EMI's cut. But even still, it didn't pass the smell test. It didn't pass the smell test.
And this was part of a culmination of many lawsuits that they'd had that did go back to the 31st of December 1970. So they'd been in litigation with each other in some form or another for the better part of 19 years. And the documents that led to a final settlement were on the 7th of November 1989. And if you think about the late 80s, the Beatles go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Paul doesn't turn up because there's a legal problem.
There's a legal issue.
And he doesn't turn up to the When We Was Fab issue, and he says the legal problem is an issue. And if you go to the Bible of all these things, Peter Doggett's book, You Never Give Me Your Money, he talks about how, the legal costs were threatening to outstrip their potential earnings. And, the McCartney override was a key sticking issue. The Beatles eventually settled, signing on the 7th of November 1989. And the terms were kept secret, but the 2 main things that came to pass was that the Beatles all got the same royalty rate. They were all bumped up to meet the McCartney override. But also that Apple and the 4 owners of Apple, George, Paul, Ringo, and the estate of John / Yoko, Apple had a say over whatever Beatles projects were to come out, which is key.
Yes. Because
there'd been some argument about, whether Apple was an active business or agency or not. And this lawsuit says, no, now we really, really are. In charge of claiming for all of this.
And this is the point where Apple Records starts looking at reissue programs and to sort of bolster that notion.
Yes. Well, the other lawsuit that's kind of happening at the same time and tips over into the 90s is when the Beatles are suing Apple, the Beatles Corporation is suing Apple Computers because of a previous agreement that they'd had that Apple Computers wouldn't get involved in the music business. And once again, Neil Aspinall, dog with a bone, won't let it go, says no. If Apple in the late 80s were putting music chips into their computers, and obviously anybody buying a computer at that time was like, am I buying a Beatles record or am I buying a computer? I am totally confused. It really couldn't say. But what Aspinall managed to do was to get about 25 odd million in settlement from Apple Computers for this breakdown in an agreement that they wouldn't go into the music business, and that was essentially a kind of a seed capital almost for
what was to come.
What was to come. Apple now had a big lump sum in the bank from Apple Computers. They had the Beatles all settled their agreements with EMI. They were all under the one umbrella of this Apple organisation in order to make it happen. But even still, you could still say in 89, 90, George wasn't on board. And I recall first hearing about this project when Paul was on his 89, 90 tour, and he would say, oh, we'd love to make a documentary and we'd love to do a little bit of music for it and all the rest. And I'd like, oh, that'd be interesting. And George was being quite nasty, wasn't he?
He was.
What was he saying?
Well, he always took the view that, oh, well, if Paul is looking for some publicity for something, for a new record or a tour, he will say, oh, we could get back together, we could do something. And this is the point in 89 is where Harrison says famously, as far as I'm concerned, there won't be a Beatles reunion as long as John Lennon remains dead.
Yes. And he's also saying things, George, like, well, he didn't want to write with me back then. Why does he want to write with me now? And
yes, that was it. He's left it a bit late. That's all I can say. So again, this is Paul saying, oh, it'd be great to write something with George. And I think at this point,
well, George's stock is high at this point, and he's done the Wilburys, and he knows what a collaborative group is like.
Yes.
So he's not totally saying that in a vacuum.
No, I mean he's coming off the back of Cloud 9. He's had an American #1 single. He's in the supergroup with Bob Dylan. He doesn't need this.
So the second thing that kind of kicks in though in 91 is George's financial situation.
Yes.
So tell us what goes on.
Well, George had become involved, sort of well-known story about handmade films, and this was formed to finance the Monty Python, Life of Brian. It sort of then went on, it gathered a pace, it became a very successful sort of British independent film company. There's a very good documentary, Accidental Studio, came out last year. I recommend people go and check that out. So it had a lot of success, but then it had some failures, and I suppose the one that everyone knows about is Shanghai Surprise.
Yes, there were some other movies that I'd never heard of that came out in the late 80s.
There were quite a few movies that came out. What it seemed to do was it started off, it made Life of Brian, then it was involved in things like Time Bandits. Then the Pythons moved away, and the reason why they moved away was because they didn't entirely trust Dennis O'Brien.
So Dennis O'Brien is George's partner in Handmade.
Yes, and he was essentially George's manager to all intents and purposes. So after Klein exits, George suddenly discovers he's got a tax bill that Klein hasn't been paying the tax. Dennis O'Brien comes in and sorts out George's tax problems, and as the facilitator of this, sorting out this problem, he really has George's trust.
Yeah.
So he and George are now involved in handmade films. Everything is going swimmingly until suddenly the ambition that O'Brien has seems to sort of outstrip the ability to deliver. He starts getting involved or trying to involve himself in creative decisions rather than just on the financial side. The whole thing starts to unravel. George suddenly finds that the way this company has been geared or has been structured, he is getting sort of 50% of the profit, but is responsible for 100% of the risk. So O'Brien, through a very complicated web of sort of companies and offshore trusts, etc., the very thing that the Pythons were suspicious about, has managed to sort of get George into the position that he's sort of down to his last few million. His house is at risk. He's 25 million is the figure that's being bandied about, and he ends up suing Dennis O'Brien. Doggett, I think, will say in his book, George is basically told, you are on the verge of bankruptcy here.
Yes.
You need to do something to sort this out. George's instinct is just to sort of do nothing and not get involved. This reports him just phoning up the entire and sacking everyone.
Yeah, he rings up Handmaid, apparently
says, "You're all sacked,"
closes it down, and then tries to.
But then suddenly realises, well, that's not good enough.
Yeah.
There is still this debt. So he's embarking on these lawsuits against Dennis O'Brien. He is successful at the end of the day.
He puts a lawsuit out for $25 million, and I think gets an $11.6 million settlement. But how much of that money he ever actually gets?
This is the thing. Actually collecting on that is difficult, and this is the sort of sad aspect of the last sort of years of George's life are spent chasing down. He loses. He's terribly ill and he can't attend a court, so therefore he loses that court battle, and simply because he's too sick to attend.
Yes.
So, but anyway, the key thing here in around 91, 92 is
cash flow, basically.
Cash flow.
And he's got, the first thing he tries to do is he goes out on tour with Eric Clapton in Japan.
Yes.
With a notion that this might be a fully fledged US tour, but he's like, no, not doing that.
He says, he quite enjoyed it, but I think he just did not have the appetite in the context of what the Beatles had to go through, what he went through in 74 on his US tour.
Yes.
He doesn't have the appetite for that.
And so eventually realising he's on the verge of bankruptcy in 1992, he
has to be friends with Paul.
More or less. He starts to succumb to the notion, because 1992 is when formally the production of the Beatles Anthology starts. We start to get interviews being recorded and clips being laid down. We're still a while off from Free as a Bird and all that kind of stuff, but 1992 is when it goes into a very tangible form of production. And
that's the period at which, as you say, George and Paul start to affect a reconciliation.
Yes.
They've got a working relationship again.
They meet in California at some point in 92, don't they?
Yes, sort of in December 1992 they meet, and then the very next day in December, McCartney has a press conference for his world tour, and he's saying, "We are intending the Beatles are back. There's going to be a musical reunion."
Yes.
And at this stage, it's sort of talk about incidental music for the film and that sort of thing. Yeah. On this occasion, Harrison says nothing. So previously, he's been slapping Paul down and knocking that back and saying this isn't happening, and really Paul needs to wind his neck in. Here, nothing. So Paul is...
And then in 93, Paul puts out Off the Ground, and he's doing bits of touring as well in 93, and he's again going into that mode of, we're going to do this documentary. He knows in 93 when he's touring and talking to the media that it's definitely happening.
Yes. I mean, by this stage, the middle of 92, those interviews that appear in Anthology with Jules Holland, he's already doing those in mid-92. So by the back end of 92, it's well on.
It's a real thing.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
And the third thing I mentioned that kind of happens is that there's kind of a general... People are just getting old in the late 80s, early 90s. Ringo sobers up in 89, gets back on the road, gets a bit of clarity in his life, gets a bit of direction in his life. Paul and Yoko have a rapprochement over, Paul. There's these very odd 1990 gigs in celebration of John Lennon, and Paul appears at one of them, and he does give peace a chance, and Yoko's very touched by this, and it kind of opens doors. Sean Lennon appears on stage with Julian Lennon. Which is obviously a big deal, and at some point Yoko and Sean visit Paul and the family in the farm. Early 90s, some point.
This is yes, and actually record. Hiroshima Sky is always blue.
So there's whether it's I don't want to say it's not sincere, but it's obviously there to facilitate a trial of understanding to get things further along.
I think what you can, I think my take on it is that they're working together.
Yeah.
They've got this litigation out of the way in 89, and the first couple of years of the 90s, they're coming to an accommodation.
Yes.
And I think you're absolutely right to say that there is clearly an appreciation at this stage that there is a legacy, there is a history, there's a story to be told. And the other thing to bear in mind is the number of books that are being written about the Beatles by other people.
Yeah. The Albert Goldman book was a thing that brought Yoko and Paul together.
Exactly. So other people are writing books. Other people are, anyone that has ever met the Beatles, that has ever kind of, made them a sandwich, is writing, cut their hair, is writing a book. So I think the notion that one, we have a story, our story to tell, and secondly, if people are going to make money off this, we should be making money off this. Because for all of them, Paul and George in particular, I think there is always that background, the merchandising in the 60s, the money that got away, that is a rankle still, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. So that's how we get from 1968 to 1992. All the ducks are finally in a row for the Beatles Anthology to become a very real, tangible thing. The legal rows are settled. Paul, George, Ringo and Yoko have a way of communicating through business and through legalities. There's financial needs on some parts. There's the need to reclaim glory and legacy on others. But by 1992, the cameras roll on what will eventually become the Beatles Anthology when it comes out in 1995. But we're going to talk about that some other time. We're going to scatter a couple of Beatles Anthology at 25 episodes throughout 2020. And so we're going to look at the shows and the music and the legacy and all those issues in future podcasts. But for now, that has been the road to Anthology. We remain available in the usual places. We're on Twitter at BeatlesPod. We have a Facebook group, so go on to Facebook, look for the Nothing Is Real group and ask to join. And subscribe and download wherever you are. Leave us a nice review if you can, or just get in touch any way you want. But for now, I'm Jason Carty.
I'm Stephen Cockcroft.
And this has been Nothing Is Real. Thanks for listening. This podcast is powered by Acast.